I come to you in the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. So when I picture wilderness, when I have the thought wilderness in my head, I picture a place of beauty. I picture a place of connection with God, with our Creator. I picture a place of creation. I picture a place of immense and profound connection to God. I think of this place, whether it's going on a hike in the forest or being out on the water or even up on the top of the mountain and able to look out over all of creation to see all of the beauty of creation laid out before me. That is where I find a deep connection to God, a place where I'm removed from all of the craziness and busyness of the world to connect deeply with God. But does that sound familiar to people? Does that sound like a place that people like to go to? A place where, I think particularly in the Pacific Northwest, that tends to be a place that we like to find connection with God. But that's not always been people's understanding of wilderness, particularly in America. That has not been how people have perceived wilderness. I actually want to read just a short passage from this book. This book is called Wilderness and the American Mind. And it talks specifically about wilderness in the time of the Puritans and how that understanding has carried forward to our modern understanding. Commenting on the arrival of the Puritans some years after, Puritan pastor Cotton Mather indicated the change in attitude that contact with the New World produced. Lady Arabella, he wrote, left an earthly paradise in England to come to America and encounter the sorrows of a wilderness. She then died and left that wilderness for the heavenly paradise. So clearly the American wilderness was not paradise. If men expected to enjoy an idyllic environment in America, they would have to make it by conquering wild country. Mather realized in 1693 that wilderness was the stage through which we are passing to the promised land. Yet optimistic Americans continued to be fooled. Instead of a garden, declared one traveler in the Ohio Valley in 1820, I found a wilderness. Elsewhere, Mather wrote quite seriously about dragons and droves of devils and fiery flying serpents to be found in the primeval forest. Indeed, legends and folk tales from first contact until well into the national period linked the New World wilderness with a host of monsters, witches, and similar supernatural beings. So that's how people thought about wilderness 400 years ago, even 200 years ago, even 100 years ago. And it's understandable, really, if you think about it. The people who would go out into the wilderness didn't often come back. And not because they died necessarily, but it was just better out there. But they didn't want to ruin it by letting other people know about that. So people didn't know it was great out there. And it's understandable, too, because the forest and the wilderness represented things that were untamed, things that were uncontrolled and unknowable, things that were scary, full of fear. Even when you think about it in times of darkness, when people would go out into this wilderness at nighttime, because it was untouched, it was, even if it was a full moon and bright sky and stars everywhere, an untouched forest, even in that kind of light of night, is almost impenetrable darkness under the trees. So it's understandable why people would have some apprehension or some fear about going into the wilderness. It's understandable why people would feel that wilderness was something that is uncontrollable and untamed and wild. Hence the term wilderness. So this is the place to which Jesus goes today, this place of wildness, this place of unknowable, uncontrollable, untamable land, this place where no one would choose to go into. And in fact, Jesus doesn't even choose to go. As it says in Mark's gospel, immediately following his baptism, he is led by the Spirit into the wilderness. This is not a vision quest that Jesus is choosing to go out on. This is a movement of the Spirit to challenge and test him. So Jesus goes out into the wilderness. And Jesus begins to fast. Jesus begins to fast for 40 days and 40 nights, to the point where he is famished. And on that 41st day, that's when Satan appears to tempt him. And isn't that the case? Satan always appears when we're at our weakest, when we're at our moment of greatest need and desire and want. That's when Satan appears to tempt us. And how does Satan tempt Jesus? Well, he tempts him with all of the things that we as human creation desire and need. He begins with something really simple. Just turn these rocks into bread. Just wave your hand. It's a minor miracle. God won't mind. Just take care of this, eat some bread, and then we can have a fair fight, you and me. And Jesus says no. So he tempts him again. He takes him to the pinnacle, the top of the temple, and says, throw yourself up. God will take care of you. That's fine. That's not a big deal. Angels will swoop down and pick you up. And again, Jesus says no. Although that one makes a little more sense. But the last one, and I think the most powerful one, is Satan changes tracks a little bit. Instead of going after base physical needs that we have as human creation, Satan tempts Jesus with a desire. Satan tempts Jesus with the desire to have power. This temptation to give power, if the good guy will only swear fealty to the bad guy, he can have all the power. He can make the utopia. He can create the beautiful kingdom as long as he just gives up a little bit of himself to the bad guy. This is a story that is so relatable and so knowable that it's traced throughout our stories and our culture and our history throughout time immemorial. I mean, it goes all the way back to this reading from Genesis today. Adam and Eve with the serpent. It's okay. You can eat that apple. You won't die. You just get a little bit more knowledge. It's not a big deal. We have this story popping up in our popular culture even. We have Lord of the Rings. Boromir, the human, is tempted to take the One Ring for himself, to bring power and stability and nobility back to the human race, and to bring balance to Middle-earth. But he doesn't take it because he knows that it is from evil and it will only corrupt. Even Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, is tempted to go to the dark side and take pieces of that dark side to balance with the light side in order to create a utopia in the galaxies. And he turns it away because he knows that power from evil corrupts. And Jesus shows us this. Jesus turns away from this. Jesus refutes this. And yet even today, this is still something we struggle with. This desire to have power. Power which gives control over this world. One of the ways that I think we see this continually perpetuating in our society and culture is the desire to have money and through money to get power. We see this especially in the news right now through the political world with billionaires and millionaires spending hundreds of millions of dollars to gain power. That's all it's about. It's just about gaining power. We even see this with politicians who, once they're elected, feel that because they're elected, they must be right and everything they believe must be right. There's no room for compromise. There's no room for differing opinions because power has been granted. That's giving in to Satan. That's giving in to this final temptation. So how do we refute it? How do we turn away from the temptation that Satan puts before us? I think we turn back to what Jesus does today. We look at the model and example that Jesus has left for us today. What does Jesus do in refuting Satan? He turns back to his relationship, his connection, his faith that he has in his relationship and connection with God. Jesus puts the onus back on God, saying, God will take care of me. God will provide me everything I need. I don't have to give up anything of myself to be corrupted in order to gain the power. God will provide everything that I need in order to be successful in this life. So how do we, in this season of Lent that we have just begun, re-find our connection with God? How do we, in this season of Lent, reconnect with God in this same manner that Jesus connects with God in this gospel story? If you were with us on Ash Wednesday, we heard from 2 Corinthians, we implore you as followers of Christ to be reconciled with God. Reconciliation, finding balance, coexisting in harmony and balance with God is how we find that connection, how we rebuild that connection to God. When we enter into this practice of reconciliation, we find connection with God, with neighbor, with all of creation around us. We're going to talk more about this today in our Seasons of Prayer gathering when we talk about how we can approach Lent in prayer. We're going to talk about this through our Wednesday programming when we talk about being stewards of creation, caring for creation. It begins with reconciliation. When we enter into this work, particularly in this set-aside season of Lent, this season of being in the wilderness with Christ, when we engage in this work, we begin to rebuild our connection. When we rebuild our connection with God, then we find our place of being able to refute Satan. When we rebuild our connection with God, we know that we are following in the footsteps of Christ, following the way of love that has been laid out before us. I invite you into this process in a holy Lent. Amen.
Amen.